Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 22nd meeting of the Education and Culture Committee in 2012. Can I remind members and those in the public gallery to switch off their mobile phones and electronic devices so that they don't interfere with the broadcasting system. We have apologies from the convener, Stuart Maxwell, and can I welcome Colin Beattie to the committee as his substitute. And Colin, do you have any interest to declare or registral interest before the committee proceeds?
Just for clarity, convener, when I was a councillor on Midlothian Council and this subject of participation in music came up, I took a position against the cuts in music tuition.
Okay, thank you. Our first item this morning is an evidence session on participation in music by children and young people, and we will be focusing on the Youth Music Initiative and charging for school music tuition. This is part of a series of one-off evidence sessions on cultural issues that the committee will be holding in advance of an evidence session with Fiona Hislop, the Cabinet Secretary for Culture and External Affairs. And later on this morning we will take evidence on differences in cultural participation across Scotland. Can I welcome to the committee Mark Traynor, who is the convener of the EIS Instrumental Music Teachers Network, Fiona Dalgetty, Chief Executive of Feis Ross, see that pronunciation, and Francis Cummins, Director of Systema Scotland Big Noise Raplock. Can I invite questions from members? Liz Smith.
Good morning. We've obviously, as a committee, been presented with a whole raft of evidence, and it's something that's been in the newspapers over the last 10 days or so. Could I just ask you if you have any thoughts at all on why there is such a wide range of situations within the local authorities across Scotland, some not making any charges for additional instrumental tuition, and some that are ranging from approximately £95 up to £340. What are the reasons, in your opinion, for the huge difference?
Thank you. I see, obviously, budget constraints across Scotland are causing huge issues for the local authorities. But in regards, from an EIS point of view, there is clearly an opportunity here to generate income, which will subsidise instrumental music services, which we feel is inappropriate in the Scottish education system. So I think that really is the problems that they're under budgetary is causing huge difficulties for local authorities to balance the books. And as I said, they obviously see instrumental music as an easy target.
When you say that, do you detect that there are specific formulas by which local authorities set the charges that are applicable? Do these charges relate just to costs, or how do they decide what the cost should be?
To our knowledge, we're not aware of how the policies are in place and how they implement charging.
Okay. When it comes to youngsters who may be exempt from these charges, could you say something about the categories that are applied there?
Again, the national picture for instrumental music is so varied that there is no national structure in place. So within the exemption categories, that can vary from free school meals to income support, to clothing grants, and there isn't really a set formula in place.
That varies right across local authorities altogether?
Yes.
Okay. Mr Traynor, could I just pursue the issue of the SQA tuition situation? You yourself and some of your colleagues in the EIS have expressed grave reservations about the fact that when it comes to SQA tuition, obviously that can be very expensive, particularly if you've got a family of more than one child and learning expensive instruments. Do you detect that that is causing some kind of compromise in the way that youngsters pick their subject choice, that because of the fees it may put some youngsters off?
We have no evidence regarding that. I would imagine it will play a very important factor in what subjects pupils choose to take. We're becoming increasingly alarmed with the fact that we now have 5 authorities that have now removed exemptions for SQA examinations, and we also have Aberdeenshire, which is announcing as of 2013-14 that they will also be removing the exemptions. So there's a growing trend here, again, of charging parents and pupils for curriculum-based subjects.
just a final point in that, do you have any reason given that they have removed the original situation where it was free exemption, now making charges? Is any reason being given?
I can only go back again, it's another way of generating income to subsidise instrumental service.
Okay, thank you.
Jean Urquhart.
I think I probably should declare an interest in as much as I was involved with the fashion movement in the early 80s and up until about 5 or 6 years ago. But I wanted to ask Mark, just continuing that, in the information that we have and in some of the press reports at the weekend, there was a kind of what I consider to be quite a sensational headline about profit. But on reading the papers, and I wonder if you can just confirm this, EIS, through Freedom of Information, had asked about the income, net income, not including legal costs, and if I'm remembering this right, and administration, but not teaching.
Not
Is that
teaching,
right?
no.
And is there? I mean, just for me, in order that I understand that, why would you not? I mean, on the one hand, it looks like a profit, but given that there is no commonality between a lot of the provision in schools, we're not comparing like with like.
From an EIS position, we see instrumental music as being tuition for all. Costs should not be involved. So looking at it from that angle, we would see that profits are being generated. If we look at within education, we don't take into account teacher salaries in the classroom, and therefore we don't see that should be included within an educational right of our young people. So from regards of the income that's been generated through charging parents, then we would say that as a possible profit revenue.
And just one further question: is there then? I mean, I imagine there must be a huge difference across the piece of what one school might provide and another school might provide, irrespective of how they charge or if they charge or don't charge. So we're not comparing necessarily like with schools that don't charge, nor are we comparing like with charges with schools that do charge or authorities that have a policy of charging.
That is the difficulty without a national framework in place. That resources are obviously at the moment are stretched, so therefore from school to school, authority to authority, there will be differences in the amount of staff that are involved.
Thank you, Chair. I'm interested in the issue of the SQA music courses. Now, in standard grade, it was quite clear that in most situations, probably 99% of the time, the children chose their subject in second year. So it's established that they're studying for an SQA and they would be exempt in some local authorities. What complication is there with the variations in curriculum for excellence, where some schools are doing a 222 presentation or a 3-3 presentation, and does that mean that students will be charged longer until they determine whether they're sitting that exam?
We have seen some evidence that authorities are removing the exemptions further up or down, whatever way you want to look at it. So now if they're taking the 3+3 approach, they're now removing the exemption from third year, which would previously have been there when they'd chosen their subject at the end of the second year. They're from the third and fourth year of SQA examinations, they would then have been exempt. So once again, the cost has been passed on to parents.
Could I maybe just say at this point, given that the focus a lot of this session will be on this issue, if any of the other witnesses have anything to add, please feel free to do so. You're not compelled to, but if you have anything to add, sorry.
And just to be clear, when we're talking about curriculum subjects, have you any evidence that the Youth Music Initiative money, which has quite specifically got clear objectives attached to it, if that is being used to subsidise the curriculum in schools at the moment?
To our knowledge, from the EIS perspective, our view of YMI is to be applauded. However, as our members are not directly involved in YMI, we don't really have an awful lot of information regarding that. In general terms, I believe that there may have been YMI money used to subsidise core services, although we don't have any actual evidence of that.
I can speak about my knowledge of YMI in Highland, and that's definitely not the case there. Highland Council
have a relationship with Fashion and Gale, our umbrella organisation, and Face Roche, and they subcontract for a large part of the YMI, and we deliver it very much for the primary 5-6 target in 108 primaries.
Okay, Marco?
Yeah, I have a question just slightly following on from Liz and Jean's points. The thing that surprised me most in the coverage was the charging for the SQA courses. Now, I understand COSLA were invited here but have refused to come, and I regret that because I would ask this question of them, but instead I'll ask it of yourself. In what way is it legal for councils to charge for core curriculum certificated courses? Is that something that is in any way ambiguous? Because it would seem to me that if you were to charge for higher English, there would be an outcry, but we now have a number of councils that are charging for other SQA certificated courses.
Obviously, from an EIS perspective, we can't comment on legalities of local authorities and the decisions they make, but I have to agree with you that if the same formula was applied to our English or Maths or Sciences, I'm sure there would be uproar amongst the public.
Just a comment on that, just through casework this week, there's a similar situation arisen in home economics. Wide variation in the charges being applied by different schools within the same authority. Liam.
Thanks, Convener. I would certainly echo Marco's comment in relation to COSLA. I think you've been asked to field a number of questions that would more, I think, appropriately be directed to them. And likewise, I would share many of the reservations expressed in relation to charging for those undertaking SQA qualifications. I know within Orkney, which is identified as one of the councils who isn't charging, that there was a very live debate within the last 12 months about whether to deviate from that and introduce charging now, while SQA certificated students were excluded from that. What was interesting was that I think one of the reasons that, in a sense, pushed this off the agenda was the fact that however they calibrated it, the sums that would be raised were really very small in comparison to what the overall operation within Orkney, which is obviously the smallest council area in the country, the overall costs of that tuition. So I think probably it follows on from Jean's earlier question. The use of the word profit and the sums raised is not at all clear to me. I mean, how would you define the profit? Is it anything that is raised, or is it only a proportion of what's raised, excluding salaries and whatnot?
The question we asked under the FOI was very clear. We asked local authorities how much net revenue did you generate through charging, and the figures that we received back were what we've obviously presented in our written submission. These are figures that we believe are detrimental to instrumental music and access for all. And as I said, taking the EIS stance that we believe that instrumental music should be free to all, then we would see this as being profit being made for local authorities to plough back into their budgets to shore up and subsidise their instrumental service budgets.
I mean, within that, I've seen the FOI request, but I mean, even following on from that, have you made any attempt to try and assess how those calculations are arrived at, how the figures are arrived at? I mean, certainly know that in the Orkney context, I think because it was such a controversial issue, the council was at pains to kind of set out fairly clearly where they felt the fees could be brought in, where they absolutely shouldn't be, and what that was set against the costs that they bore. Is that's not the experience in other council areas?
It's not something that we have pursued, and I think it would be something that we would call in Parliament to look at, and perhaps a review of instrumental services throughout Scotland, going back to such a disparity of exemptions, charging involved. I think we need to get a clearer picture nationwide before we can really start to make any assumptions and assertions in what direction we take instrumental music forward.
Most of this is probably for council, so thank you.
John McAlpine?
Yes, I realise that that your FOI related to the situation now, but do any of the panel, could they enlighten us on what the historical situation is for charging for musical tuition? I mean, has there been a point in the past where it was all free?
Well, perhaps I could speak as someone who grew up in Scotland, who had most of my training. I started my musical career in local authority, and at that point it was all free. At that point also I was a junior student at the RCS, RSMD as was, that was also free. So I think historically there has been a time where all instrumental tuition was free.
I think you would need to go back a considerable way.
Made me feel old.
No, I feel exactly. I remember back in school myself 20 odd years ago when it was free, and I think you would need to go back a considerable amount of way to find that instrumental tuition was free. And although the information has not been made available, and again this goes back to the overall picture of instrumental music and the transparency and the increase in authorities levying charges on parents is slowly starting to creep up. As these budgetary constraints can start to kick in more, as I said, they see a way of subsidising and generating income, which obviously is, from an EIS perspective over here, that we don't agree with.
Thank you, Convener. The Youth Music Initiative, a key point of that was around school-based music making, and the aim was to ensure that school children would access at least 1 year's free music tuition by the time they reach primary 6. Has that outcome actually been achieved?
I can only really speak for the areas in which Face Roche work. To my knowledge, it has. In Highland, the council choose to deliver it in 3 areas. So they offer Kadai to primary 3-4 children, which is delivered by the local authority instructors. And then we, the Face Movement, deliver to primary 5-6 for 12 weeks a year. Every pupil in primary 5 will get 2 blocks of 6 weeks tuition. The schools choose from Gaelic song, Scots song, tin whistle, group music making, and that's all linked with the level 2 outcomes and experiences for CFE, for the expressive arts, as well as some of the cross-cutting themes. And where possible, it's linked with the class topic. If the class are studying the Jacobites, we'll look at Jacobite songs, take them to the battlefield and link that in with the music part of it. So our professional musicians and tutors who are going into school are working very closely with the class teachers. We're about to deliver in Dumfries and Galloway as well. So some local authorities are using that model where they're bringing in a partner, maybe a foundation organisation of Creative Scotland, but they're bringing in a cultural partner to work with them to achieve that target.
Do we have any knowledge as to whether there's any uniformity in approach in this? I mean, I hear what you're saying about the area that you're familiar with. Is there any, there's 32 local authorities, are there 32 different approaches to this, or is there some sort of a uniform approach to achieve that single outcome?
I think each local authority takes their own approach. I think it's quite different. Before I went to work at Face Roche, I was living in Edinburgh and working at the City Council here, and their approach was quite different. They delivered the whole YMI target within the council with their own staff. They didn't work as much in partnership as Highland do, so I think it is quite different from authority to authority.
I mean, there's £8 million going into this, and I know there's some sort of Scottish Government formula that determines the distribution of the funds. So councils must make a bid, presumably, to get their share of this based on that formula. So they must have to, I would assume, have some sort of a common approach to achieve that outcome. And there must be something that's common in that approach.
I think you need to speak to Creative Scotland about that, but they do, I know, submit a proposal, and they have to show evidence that they have met their target for the previous year, that every child before P6 has had their year of free music. So there are targets that Creative Scotland are asking them to meet each year before they'll approve the next year of funding. And I think the approaches are different because different authorities choose different styles of music. So there's quite an emphasis on traditional music in Highland. There was a lot of vocal work when I was working in Edinburgh. Other authorities, if they've got a rich history of brass band in the community, they might have more brass. So it varies from authority. That's my understanding anyway.
Just out of curiosity, it says that the criteria is that by the time they reach primary 6, they'll have had 1 year's free tuition. Is there any critical point at which that is aimed in terms of achieving that? In other words, is it better at P4? Is it better at P5? I understand what you've said about the area you're familiar with, but do you know if there's a sort of an accepted criteria for that?
I think primary 5 is the usual age, but some people are doing work in the early years and starting earlier. I know that Highland Council invests from primary 3 onwards, but I think primary 5 is generally the age group.
The ones would struggle with a tuba. Claire, do you want in?
It was to go back on the idea of free education, if you don't mind me going back to that. It was just when Ms McAlpine was talking about free provision, but one of the barriers to actually taking up an instrument is the access to an instrument. And although tuition may have been free, have you any idea what the provision is in, say, Edinburgh and Glasgow, where it's free, whether the access to the instruments is the good access to the instruments for families that maybe couldn't afford to purchase them themselves?
Again, the national picture varies, especially on the authorities who are offering free tuition. Some, if I speak from my own authority, West Lothian, which is obviously doesn't charge. Generally speaking, there will be access to instruments within primary school, and then there will be an obligation from parents to either to rent or buy an instrument when they move to high school. And obviously, as we well know, regards access, I'm sure, I know travelling around primary schools and the amount of children that want to be involved in music, we could probably employ double, 3 times the amount of instrumental teachers, but again, we have to work within the resources that are already in place.
Okay, brings us very neatly to the next question, Neil.
Thanks, Convener. I think the first answer surrounded budget constraints of local authorities, and I think that's certainly having an impact in a number of areas, and this is one of them. I was going to ask, in terms of music teacher numbers and tutor numbers, we've seen a significant reduction in the overall number of teachers in Scotland over the last few years. Has there been a reduction in the number of music teachers and tutors, and are there enough music teachers and tutors to provide the provision that we want to see?
I think the answer to that, we would love more tutors. Unfortunately, I think what you're saying is correct. Over the last few years, as budgets have become tighter, what we'd seen was those staff perhaps on fixed term or temporary contracts, those contracts were not renewed to try to allow councils to balance their budgets. So I think in answer to your question, yes, there has been a reduction. And I think we are seeing services are becoming more and more stretched to fulfil their obligation to allow access for instrumental music throughout their authorities.
Yeah. Claire?
Thank you, Chair. It's really a question about the El Sistema project. I attended an event at the Parliament during the Festival of Politics and saw a presentation from El Sistema. My understanding is that the costs are roughly about £1,700 per participant to run the project. So it's really about what future plans El Sistema may have to roll out other projects across Scotland, and whether the main barriers to that are financial or capacity to actually deliver another project.
Yes, I think that the figure that I have is about 1,500, but yes, it's in that region. And I suppose on the face of it, that would appear to be very expensive. But we do work with the whole community. It's not just school-aged children. We work with preschool children. We also, in our work in Stirling, we have an arm of our work which works with the mothers and carers and babies. So we're also engaging in adult education as well. So in a sense, we're looking to develop a lifelong model from that perspective. And also, I think what we're hoping to achieve is social change. So, you know, when we look at that figure, we're also looking at what it costs. One of the exercises one of my colleagues did was to trace a problem family and work out that particular family over 7 years cost 1.7 million. that was on other, interventions. So I think it does sound expensive on the face of it, but we'd like to look at it in the context of the whole community and the whole package. With regard to your other question, we do hope very much that we can roll out our project. We saw Stirling very much as a pilot project, and we'd like to roll it out in other areas. We are in negotiations with other local authorities at various levels. A recent concert in Stirling has generated a lot of interest, and understandably so, something we're very proud of. So, yes, money is always an issue, but I hope that we could see beyond just the financial implications of a project like ours and see the social benefits and the benefits to the whole community.
Thank you. It's an absolute wonderful project, and I don't think anyone who heard or saw the concert could think otherwise. In fact, I've got my video set to tape on Thursday night. I believe it's been rebroadcast, the documentary about it. It's what I find really interesting is the overall the transformational change in the community. And I understand you're now in the 4th year of a 5-year project. So many of the young people who came to you as primary school students are now going into high school. Are you tracking their achievements in high school and the outcomes from the children to see if it's had a great change in their academic career as well as...
Yes, we are. It is very difficult to produce data at this stage because the project is in its relative infancy. There was of course the Scottish Government report which was done after 3 years, but we are working with schools and we are looking to develop a model of tracking children so that hopefully we've got some evidence at the end of this that we have transformed, that there has been an element of transformation that has impacted on their education, that has impacted on social well-being, it has impacted on their families. But but again, as I say, it really is only 4 years old, so it is early days.
Could I ask, is the project a direct lift from the project that's run in Venezuela, or is there significant differences? I think yes and no is the answer. Yes, from the perspective that what we're seeking to do is to immerse the children in music, which is very much what they do in Venezuela. The philosophy of the Venezuelan project is that it is the orchestra which will being a member of an orchestra, being a member of a community, having an identity within that community. So from those perspectives, yes, we've very much lifted our philosophical basis from what happens in Venezuela. The Venezuelans have been very, very supportive. We've had a lot of input and a lot of mentoring from them and a lot of encouragement as well. I think possibly, having been to Venezuela and having seen the methods and the modes of delivery there, I think possibly our teaching styles may differ slightly. Obviously, we have to operate within. It's a very different culture. Our children are used to learning in a very different way. They're used to relating to adults and to teachers in a very different way than the children of Venezuela. So obviously we have to, we're also very keen to work with other agencies, so we've adopted some methodology that perhaps that they don't necessarily use in Venezuela, but that's fair. But the Venezuelan mentors that we have been very supportive and encouraging to us and encouraging to me, specifically from a musical perspective, to come up with a model that's relevant to Scotland and not to try and produce a carbon copy of what they do there, particularly in methodology. And could I just ask one thing? Do they fund it directly, central government finance,
Venezuela? And
it's part of a national programme?
So are you asking about the Venezuelan? Yes, they do. I think after, and I think through various different regimes, Maestro Abreu has managed to negotiate that. But there are 500,000 children in the project in Venezuela. It is it's enormous. It's,
could I have Liam first?
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, I don't think anybody would doubt the impact. I mean, whether or not you can precisely nail it down, it clearly is having that impact, and both the intensity of the learning and the breadth of what you're able to deliver in terms of wider social impacts is impressive indeed. I think within the context of this debate, is there anything you can say in terms of the wider delivery of music tuition in Stirling, for example? Has it been impacted by having kind of Elsie Stamer on its doorstep, and either because it attracts so much attention, because it has the funding streams that it does, has that had a knock-on impact?
Well, we have sought and worked very hard to be as supportive and as to the local authority instrumental service as we can. We've shared resources with them. We've sent a number of our children to their events, and because of course part of what we're trying to do is to integrate the children from the Raploch into the wider educational community. And again, we've run a number of training events that we've invited the local authority to. We very much would like to be as supportive as we can. We're not out to set up in competition. Our aims are slightly different. I mean, we do have an aim for musical excellence, but that's not essentially, we're not out to be an alternative to the local authority. So we are supportive of them and see them very much as colleagues and partners.
Just on that theme, Mr. Traynor, you made reference to this earlier as well, that obviously I have to agree entirely with Claire Adams. I think it's fantastic what you have achieved, but obviously we want to try to allow that to happen in as many places as we possibly can. Mr. Traynor, you said about opportunities for every pupil. Do you foresee, if these charges in some limited form are going to happen, and you in your comments at the weekend you were saying that you don't think that you see any quick change to that, do you think there is any scope for cultural trusts or for local businesses to be involved in helping to deliver some of these musical opportunities?
The EIS position on it that instrumental music is part of education. It's funded centrally from local authorities and from government. It's an important role to play in young people's lives. The evidence now that's been shown throughout the world, and again here in the UK, Professor Sue Ham, with its educational benefits, I believe that is a road for central government and for local authorities to fund, not for private. I see Elsie Stemmer's position as enhancing. I think it's quite right, working in partnership with what goes on within schools. I think what Systema has achieved is to be applauded and welcomed. But we need to ensure that every pupil in Scotland has access and the opportunity to learn a musical instrument, regardless of costs, regardless of their geographical location. That's how we see it.
For a sea change in local authority priorities?
Yes.
Okay.
Jean, yeah.
Can I ask you, Mr. Cummings, do you apply for Youth Music Initiative funding for El Sistema?
I don't think we have, no. I'm sorry, I'm almost 100% sure that we haven't applied to the Youth Music Initiative for funding.
According to the website, you don't have any public money?
No, we don't. Well, we haven't up until now had any public money, no. We have a professional fundraiser who takes care of that, so I'm not entirely sure. So I wouldn't want to be dishonest, but to the best of my knowledge, no, I don't think we did apply for youth music.
Just interested. And just kind of on the same theme, I think, Mr. Traynor, can you tell me, are your members involved in the delivery of music that is being charged for? And is that in school time?
Yes, as much has been branded about in the press about extracurricular, instrumental lessons are delivered during the school day by instrumental staff, and also instrumental staff can prepare and deliver up to 60% of an SQA candidate's music exam. So, in answer to the question, it's during the school day, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Based on both the issues of charging and also the projects that are in effect around the country, do you think there are any young people who are seeking musical opportunities in their education that aren't having those provided to them? Is there an unmet demand out there?
I think the Youth Music Initiative has been a fantastic initiative in meeting those demands, and the Pathways to Music through Young Scot is a great way for young people in Scotland to access music. Another initiative that the Youth Music Initiative funds is the Music Plus scheme through the Scottish Music Centre in Glasgow, and I do think that YMI is very effective, and in my experience it has provided opportunities for young people who weren't previously accessing music making opportunities. We as an organisation have been doing lots of work in Highland with a joint education and social work service in Inverness called The Bridge. Those young people had very little, if any, arts provision at the centre. They've now recorded their own album of songs that they've written, had a CD launch. We've been working in partnership with Live Music Now and Drake Music Scotland, working with young people with additional support needs who previously weren't accessing music making. And we have 2 pupils at Drummond School in Inverness who are learning to play the fiddle. And those are all routes that have been possible because of YMI.
From an EIS member's perspective, as soon as you introduce any form of charges, you will exclude a group. And what we are finding, because either of exemptions in place for free meals, etc., it's this middle tranche who are just on that line, borderline, who are making the decision as families: can we afford to pay these amounts each year, or do we have to focus on something else and prioritise? I would say that YMI, as I say, we have really no formal position on YMI, as our members aren't really involved in it. I would say that we applaud it, we welcome it. I think it's been really groundbreaking, but one of the concerns that the instrumental teachers have is that the longer term strategy, when they have that 1 year of free tuition, where do they go then? The difficulty is, if they're in a charging authority, the choices that parents will make. My son, my daughter loved this. It was a fantastic opportunity, a great experience, something they'd like them to continue, but we cannot afford that. Local authority instrumental services are at times finding it difficult to perhaps absorb the numbers that are involved in the YMI projects.
I think that pathway, Mark, that you've spoken about, the experience that I have of Face Ross working in partnership with Fashion and Gale and Highland Council, that model works well, and that we offer these 12-week blocks of tuition in school, and then young people who have become really interested and want to continue that can either access through the music service, or Face Ross runs a series of after-school classes. So there's this ladder of progression that a young person can then come to one of our music centres after school. They might then come to a residential course for a week that we run. Eventually they might become part of our training programme for 16 to 25-year-olds on the Cayley Trail, and then it's now come full circle 25 years later, where many of them are coming back and teaching for us. But I don't know if that's replicated in many or any other local authorities, but that partnership works well in Highland.
I think from an EIS perspective, what we are looking for is fairness across the board, and at the moment that's clearly not shown throughout local authorities, when we have such a huge range of charging from £0 up to £340. And again, the quote was used as a postcode lottery. Effectively, yes, an authority next to one can be charging and the other is not, and therefore access and opportunities are then reduced considerably.
Joan?
Yes, is there any evidence that where you live, in terms of whether you live in a rural or remote area, affects cultural participation, actually physically getting to access musical tuition?
From an EIS point of view, that we have no evidence that we could bring to the table regarding that. I think if you wanted to surmise, I would imagine that the geographical distances, especially within, for instance, Highland Authority, would cause huge problems. I know that there are area groups that take place throughout the year that we can see pupils travelling from as far as Wick down into Inverness and Fort William to be involved in groups, and again that's additional costs, expenses for local authorities. So although we don't have any evidence, I would imagine it would have a direct impact on access to pupils to enjoy instrumental music.
Fish Ross have been looking at different strategies of dealing with the geography really of Rothschild alone, although we work nationally, but the county that we're based in, where a lot of our after-school provision works, is vast. And not every young person is going to be able to get to an after-school music centre that we run, if you live in Scorrig, for example. And we do have these residential courses in the holidays for a week where people can come, and those young people access those. And in between times, we've been developing online learning resources that are free to download from our website, so young people and their teachers can access those at the moment.
I suppose from the El Sistema point of view, being part of a community where your children aren't dispersed, where there's already a community that the orchestra reflects, must be very important to your philosophy, is it? Yes, it is. I think it's the children belonging to, and you know, there's a group identity. You know, it's almost like belonging to a gang, really, isn't it? But hopefully without the criminal element. And I think that is important for children to have that. You know, I couldn't really answer your question with regard to rural areas, but I think there probably are large urban areas where there is no access. There may be access on paper, but children aren't accessing necessarily music in schools, and I think cost is, of course, a very important part of that. But I think there are wider issues to access than just cost. Even though we would support free, and of course we would support free instrumental lessons. But I think there are other issues. For example, in the Raploch, I don't think before we came in, I want to be careful about numbers because I'm not entirely sure. I know there was one child in the whole estate that played a string instrument. So clearly, you know, the children on the estate, for whatever reason, weren't accessing the instrumental services that were available locally. And I think that's another question for another day. But that's something that we feel very passionately about.
Claire?
I was just asked supplementary in the residential courses that you run. Is there a cost involved to those participating in the residential?
There is a cost. It's subsidised by various grants that we managed to bring in. So we're supported by Highland Council and Creative Scotland and our umbrella body, who received funding that's passed down through them to us from HIE. So the real cost, I think, is around £350 per young person, and the charge is £250 for a residential place. And then we offer subsidised places and invite families to have conversations with us and try very much to treat people as individuals and look at a case-by-case basis.
Dean?
I suppose I would like to ask Mr. Traynor, because what we're hearing, you know, from very diverse delivery of tuition and for very different reasons. El Sistema, quite different background and set of outcomes to the fashion movement, for example. And I wonder where, if, given that we acknowledge the findings that you have of the differences, the unfairness, if you like, of provision, that some people might be denied and others not. And I appreciate that it's a key to this too is finance. But I wonder if your members have a feel for what a service should look like. I mean, Fèis Ross, for example, started because there was no traditional music taught in schools. None. Only less than 30 years ago. Not only that, there was no grants available from the Arts Council for traditional music. It was seen as kind of a bit of a dirty word. And I have to say that without a Catholic priest in Barra, starting with a few families, you know, would there be a Celtic Connections? And I'm not being flippant in saying that. The first Celtic Connections concert, more than 50% of the programme came from people on the back of a voluntary organisation delivering a service that was denied. So, you know, they are very different, and I wonder what service you know, in the great scheme of things, if we were really blue sky thinking, what service would you, do you see that all of these organisations have a place and a role in Scotland? I mean, I don't know how many children now, Face Ross is a part of an organisation that there's how many organisations and how many children or young people are involved?
Approximately 40,000 young people in Scotland take part in the Face Ross is the only one with paid staff. There's another 40 plus, maybe 42 community fashion that are run by parents and teachers and volunteers in the community who deliver usually the residential model and some follow-on classes throughout the year.
So that's 40,000 young people the length and breadth of Scotland. But that, presumably that programme, Mr. Traynor, would somehow fit in, or do you see that as something that will always be separate?
I think overall in the ideal world of where we would be, we would like to see diversification. I think it's important that young people have the opportunities to embrace all cultures and music. I think one of the things that YMI highlighted was that within the Central Belt there was very little traditional Scottish music going on, and with the money from YMI that's opened that up to allow young people to experience. So I see there's a place for everyone. I think Systema has a definite role to play within the social context, and you know the other organisations are there as from the cultural aspect and musical aspect that they can bring into education. I think we need to be careful, and this is the difficulty we have, that as funding becomes ever more tighter, that groups like ourselves who are all pulling in the one direction are fighting for financial support to achieve the same goals. And we are very careful that we sit here as three different groups, but with the same objective. And that needs to be, we need to be clear from that. From the EIS perspective, historically, instrumental music has been the responsibility of local governments, and we wish to see that continue. But I do see no reason why working in partnership or working together as one group within a local authority is not achievable.
Just quickly, Jean.
Just quickly, and I'm not thinking this through probably, but I would have thought that actually all of you have different. I don't think it is the same. I don't think it's the same to say that the ambition of the fashion movement for people to understand and know Gaelic language and their traditional music is the same as a social context, a context that El Sistema works in, and presumably at an academic level and professional teachers looking to teach quite differently and actually attain a different goal. Would you not say? I mean, they can complement each other, but are they? I don't know that they all each have the same thing. I'm just.
Perhaps I could just, all our teachers at El Sistema are qualified. They are qualified musicians, and they are. We are seeking, as well as social transformation. We do have, a very rigorous curriculum. I mean, that was why I was appointed to oversee the curriculum and to ensure that what we're delivering musically is of the highest order. Yes, we are a social project, and primarily that is our aim, but we do see that delivering musical excellence and the best possible pedagogic models that we've adopted are important in that transformation. So it kind of felt that we weren't taking the actual content of our delivery as perhaps as some others, but I can assure you we are.
One of the, I think, very good strategic things that have come out of the Youth Music Initiative, Face Ross has recently been involved in establishing the Highland Youth Music Forum, is the funding available to establish music forums in every local authority area, bringing together everybody. So the Highland Youth Music Forum has got representatives of groups who are Norman Bolton, the instrumental music service manager in Highland, is on that group. We're on that group. There's samba music, there's jazz, there's everything, and we're working together strategically because I think the young people certainly who come to Face Ross see it as all being the same. Some of them who come up to our residential event in October, they're classical violinists who love traditional music, who listen to Radio 1. And I think we have to bear that in mind as well when we're looking at the bigger picture.
Obviously, we've talked a lot about the budget pressures local authorities are under this morning, and it's clear that council tax revenues aren't providing the level of free music tuition we would want to see. I would just wonder, given that councils are charging for music tuition, whether you would consider that a tax, a cultural tax?
Charging parents, I would consider that as an additional tax. I think one thing we have to be clear, although we talk about free instrumental tuition, it isn't free. Each of these parents pay taxes, they pay council tax, and therefore they're once again having to pay out money for something that they feel that they're contributing to.
Liam?
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I think probably echo Mr Cummings' comments around the urban rural dynamic. That, I mean, obviously I represent a constituency which doesn't necessarily have the geographic scale of Highland or even Rossshire, but is geographically challenging when you're having to get on a ferry or onto a plane in order to access lessons. And yet, nevertheless, both Orkney and Shetland, I think, are blessed to have a very fine musical tradition, which was part of the controversy around charging, and clearly Shetland and Orkney have taken a different approach in that context. In relation to the point about the revenues raised here, I mean, I appreciate, again, this is probably one more for COSLA or individual councils. Is there anything to suggest that the money being raised through this charging, these charges, is being, in a sense, ring-fenced or redirected into either expanding the range of instruments or the type of music that is open to children and young people in those council areas, perhaps even trying to encourage those who have been resistant in the past to take up a musical instrument? I mean, is there any evidence of that? I appreciate I'm asking you to come up with a justification for something you're implacably opposed to, but I'm fishing around here.
I think you're right in what you said. I think, you know, that's a question for COSLA. I think what you would probably see if you look into the local authorities, that money probably would not be invested in instruments, etc., but more there to shore up and subsidise the staff involved in the running of the service. That would be what I would take as a summary of that.
From what you've seen of the list of councils that have charged and what they're charging, is there any correlation between the councils that are charging perhaps at the upper end and a resistance to the cuts in staffing or what is available locally against those who are either not charging or charging at the lower end, and the cuts that they've had to introduce in terms of numbers of teachers or instruments available? Is there any correlation there at all?
To my knowledge, I wouldn't say that a number of authorities have increased in staffing levels. So I would surmise that the money being raised is there to support what is already in place. And as I said, I think that would be a specific question for COSLA.
It's my understanding, because of the traditional music interest in Highland, I think I'm right in saying that they've appointed 2 new instructors this year in piping and pipe band drumming, and also invested in those instruments.
Okay, Marco, very briefly.
Yes, there was. It was touched on before, I think, by yourself, Mr. Cummings, that some of the issues in some parts of the country and trying to get people in because of the nature of music or provision. And I very much take on board the benefits of the YMI at primary school level. I do think across to a different subject, though, which is PE, which has had quite a substantial shift in how it's taught in terms of what is offered and what the language is that's spoken in order to appeal to young people. Do you think that has happened in music in the same way? And if not, is it something that should perhaps be thought of in terms of the teaching of music in secondary so as to appeal very broadly to what I think someone for the next session called the Britain's Got Talent generation?
I'd say again that the difficulty we have was with resources within local authorities. I think the context of PE is, again, it's shifted considerably. The emphasis placed on the importance of it, and I think to try and emulate that within music would be very difficult within the constraints of staffing levels that we have at this time.
I mean, in particular, the kind of experiences offered rather than perhaps the political focus on it. Because in PE, 15 years ago, if somebody had suggested that dance would be incorporated in PE, they would have been laughed at, and indeed they were, because that was when it was being suggested. But now it's considered to be a very effective way of bringing young people in. You know, is there a parallel there for music at all? Is that, in a way, what El Sistema does in terms of at least offering the community? I'm just interested.
I think what we offer in some ways is quite different to, and I think probably the same for most instrumental teachers, is probably quite different from the content of our delivery would be, I imagine, quite different from the content of the delivery in a typical secondary school classroom. Because I guess what we're seeking to do is to skill the young people in a very specific set of skills that you know, playing an instrument and all that involves. The secondary school curriculum is understandably much broader than that. But from my experience, you know, I have been a secondary school teacher as well. I do think there has been a broadening of the curriculum. I do think that teachers work hard to make their subject accessible, and you know, some would say perhaps it's gone too far the other way. I don't know, but you know, it's accessible and using language. You know, being culturally relevant to the sort of music that young people are listening to, you know, engaging them in technology, all that sort of thing, which again is something that we're looking to do at Sistema, to you know, explore the role of technology and you know, because that's the sort of, that's the language of the children that we are teaching. So yes, I suppose more probably could be done, but there's but I think that is very much at the forefront of many musical educators' thinking.
Claire, did you want back in?
No, thanks.
Final question.
Thank you. My question really is, I guess, directed to you, Mr. Trainer, too, as to why this time. I mean, I remember as a parent of children at school getting a letter from Highland Council saying that music tuition would need to be paid for, and I can confess, if that's the right word, that I wrote back and asked why music had been selected and not maths for payment. But this is not, it's not new. Are you perceiving the situation to be much worse, or were your members, have they been challenging this philosophy of charging for music for the last 20 years?
I think charging in its degrees has continued to increase. I think from our point of view, we'd seen 11 local authorities of this year announcing increases, well above in the rate of inflation. But I think, you know, at this time, with obviously Curriculum for Excellence, creativity being embedded right at the heart of it, that music has such an important role to play within it. If you're removing that from our young people's education, Curriculum for Excellence is not going to work. And I think at this time, as access has been restricted, and again, an old phrase of an old tutor of mine, we're returning to that phrase of who pays plays. And that is not the culture, I believe, that we are trying to encourage within Scottish education.
Okay, thanks. Can I say, I'm sure, I hope I speak for the rest of the committee and say that there's tremendous support for music of all types, all traditions around the table, and certainly across Scotland in general. And I would like to thank you and your members for their efforts in working with our young people in particular. But clearly there is a very inconsistent, patchy and unequal provision across the country. And I know that members will want to take that up with the Cabinet Secretary when she comes before us. I'm just wondering, is there any other issues that you would like us to raise on that occasion? If you want to write to us with your suggestions, we're happy to do that as well.
I think some joined-up thinking. The patchy delivery that there is, and the content of that delivery. I think that could be greatly improved. I'm speaking now not as the director of Music for Systema, but as a professional musician and a teacher. I think that is something that could be looked at, examined, improved upon, and would enrich everybody's life, the children's lives. It would be much more cost efficient, and I think most musicians and teachers would welcome that.
I think going on from that, from an EIS stance, we'd be looking for a national policy to look at instrumental tuition. We would welcome a review of it, as I say, to gather more information. I think we need a lot more information before we can take it forward, but I think a national policy, more joined up thinking between all parties that are involved within music, as I said, although that we may be looking at things from different areas, I think ultimately our goal is the same, about allowing our young people access to music and Scottish culture through music.
Okay, thank you very much. And if we can agree also that it would be worth writing to COSLA and asking them to submit some written evidence in relation to this issue. Can I thank everyone, and can we have a few minutes recess till we change over the witnesses? Okay, our second item this morning is an evidence session on the differences in cultural participation across Scotland. And can I welcome to the committee Robert Livingston, Director of High Arts. is it High Arts or H1 Arts?
High Arts.
High Arts, thank you. Julie Tate, Director, Culture Sparks, and Fiona Ferguson, Development Director, Imaginate. Can I invite questions from members? Liam MacArthur first.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. The latest Scottish Household Survey suggests that almost 9 in 10 adults have participated in cultural activity or attended a cultural event over the last year. This is impressive at one level, but it's a figure that's not changed markedly, I don't think, over the last 4 or 5 years. And I wonder whether you have any inspirational ideas about how we reach into that further 10% and try and nudge that figure up yet further.
Can I kick off? Yeah. I think the difficulty with the householder survey is that it doesn't get at issues of opportunity and motivation. If you notice, the figure for, say, attendance at cinema in remote rural areas is quite high. There's two very obvious reasons for that. One is the Screen Machine mobile cinema, and the other is a network of digital equipment that Scottish Screen and then Regional Screen Scotland have funded in those communities. I think there's a strong correlation between the areas of deprivation that are noted in the research and the lack of access to quality product in those communities. And that's, of course, then linked to transport issues. And if you're living in Airdrie, your chance to see high-quality French theatre, for example, is going to be fairly small, and the difficulty and cost of getting up to Glasgow or Edinburgh to see it, if you're not a car owner, is going to be quite substantial. So I think you need to look behind the figures and at the actual physical circumstances and the opportunities that are available for people to participate.
Yeah, thanks. It's a $1 million question, isn't it? With that, I think the issues, there is still room to grow, and certainly across all of the sort of range of customer segments and lifestyles. I think one of the challenges, there's a high degree of churn within the sector, particularly within venues where we're attracting clearly people to come and see work for the first time. And then we're maybe losing them. It's almost like, you know, a leaky bucket. We're investing an awful lot in bringing people in, but then retaining people coming back. And partly that's a lot about access issues and the type of scheduling. But it really is looking deeper at things like how people have their first engagement with the cultural world. And then where they are led after that, it's seen in other parts of the world that there's the importance of role models. People, once you attract somebody into a venue or to work, they're kind of caretaken and led and signposted in different ways. So there's lots of things around the very type of performance schedules and programming. So we tend to be, certainly within the performing arts, performing in the same kind of way. There's a set kind of schedule, a set kind of time frame. There's things like I'm seeing the arts world as an opportunity to do different things, not just come and see art, but there's an element of making connections and socialising. So there's something around repositioning it, and also being able to plan in advance. So there's this kind of logistic around coming to the art. So there's some quite practical things I think we can do to shift that pattern. Looking primarily at where people get their first introduction, and also seeing it being a relationship that we have to build with people, not just selling them a ticket or selling them one-time workshop. And it's often very difficult for organisations to do that. It's helped now by digital technologies, but at this particular point, it's very, very difficult to sustain a relationship with people across time. If you're buying a BMW car and you bought a car at BMW garage, you wouldn't just be encouraged to buy one. Crude analogy, but certainly they would see you as part of their constituency that they would want to then encourage and nurture and encourage a repeat visit. I don't know if you...
Well, my area of research is more to do with children's performing arts, and I think there's certainly looking at getting more access to children to high quality arts would in the long term affect those figures of adult participation, I'm quite sure. And we've been doing a lot of work looking at what happens in Denmark and how they fund children's theatre.
they have 150 companies funded either on a project level or a core level to create work that goes directly into schools, not into big venues in the cities, but directly into their schools. We currently have 2 for a country of the same population. So I think from Imagineate's point of view, we'd love to see real investment in work going directly into schools, because that's the only way that children have equality and access. If you want to look at all the different reasons why people aren't attending schools, village halls, covers all the rural disadvantage and financial disadvantage.
It's interesting, your comment, the comparison there with Denmark. I mean, is that then borne out in terms of the figures amongst adults in Denmark that are accessing cultural events later in life?
That I don't know. I only know about their children's sector, but they certainly have, in terms of access to work within their schools, an incredible array of choice.
I'm interested in the point about opportunity and motivation. I think, Mr. Livingston, you mentioned the mobile screen. I had the pleasure of attending a show of the mobile screen in one of the North Isles in Orkney, in Sandy, a number of years back, and as the wind whistled round this mobile unit, I sat there watching The Perfect Storm, which seemed to be rather appropriate. But obviously Orkney is somewhere where the opportunity to engage with culture is almost ever present, not necessarily something we take for granted, but I think in terms of the notion that those in rural areas may struggle to access cultural events, I think is given a lie by the experience in Orkney. I mean, you referred to the person in Ayrshire wanting to access French theatre. Now, I could perhaps understand that accessing French theatre in parts of Ayrshire may be difficult, but I don't suppose the person who wants to access French theatre in Ayrshire is necessarily somebody who struggles to engage with culture and cultural experiences. It's just that the variety of those may be constrained, and therefore, is that 10% we're not getting to falling victim to the fact that what we're trying to do is spread the breadth of cultural experience for those who are already engaging, rather than concentrating on in extending that 9 out of 10 adults into that stubborn 10%, which I would assume probably follows a fairly consistent demographic trend over the last number of years.
Pick up on something Julie said. I think it's partly about new ways of presenting work. The huge success of Oran Moore's Play Pie in a Pint, about something that you can take an hour at lunchtime. In Inverness, we have a local voluntary group that present a series of concerts in the townhouse at one with music. The audience is almost exclusively elderly, partly because they've got the free time to attend during the day, but also it means the transport's readily available. They don't have to come out at night. It's a straight 50-minute concert, and they're hearing something of fantastic quality. There's something about being locked into the pattern of shows that start at 7:30 and run for 2 or 2.5 hours that I think is quite a disadvantage for many people for many reasons.
One of the real challenges is the polemic that we always talk about in terms of you're either an attender or a non-attender, and if you're an attender, you're in a particular demographic, and generally people describe that as somebody who's affluent, well-educated and professional. And I think certainly we're just about to complete the research that I alluded to in the paper, which shows a significant engagement over the 2.5 million households. And if you profile that national picture of engagement, it spans a huge demography. And there are regional variations, but when you look to the 10%, it's the same 10% I think you have a challenge with within education and within social enterprise and within, indeed, the commercial world. There's a core of the population who are almost completely disengaged, and the reasons for that are many and varied. Some of them, clearly it's poverty of aspiration, some of it's clearly poverty. But I think if you're asking about that particular segment, it's probably it is a bigger challenge for the arts section, the arts sector. They're facing the same challenges within the education sector. I think what we need to is understand what it is more about that, and look at where people are within their communities and what the cultural infrastructure and social infrastructure is within that to connect people up. So the projects around cultural mapping are really interesting at the minute. So if you imagine a kind of three-dimensional map where you've got what the population actually looks like, not are they rich or are they poor, but how would you describe in a segment? What the social fabric is underneath that. So how are the police, the social work, how are the communities engaged under that? And then what's the cultural infrastructure? Not the arts provision, but the cultural infrastructure, both informal and formal. And one of our challenges is that when we pull people in, their engagement comes usually first from their practice or participating. They have to have some connection if they've not driven that connection through education or their family. So you've kind of got to kind of almost have that helicopter look, and we've beginning to get some of that work. But then it's about focusing all of our attention on that core, because on their own, a single arts organisation can't actually address that 10%. We first of all have to understand who it is, and we've got the information, I think, very specifically now to begin to start to drill down that. I think your challenge is how do you address that in a multi-agency kind of way? And that's certainly been our experience in Glasgow within the East End, where we're trying to look at legacy projects around about the cultural infrastructure and sport for the post-Commonwealth Games.
I mean, you seem to be reinforcing the point about the importance of education in this, whether it's kind of raising aspirational levels or exposing children and young people to experiences that they then seek to explore further. And
certainly there's research in North America, you know, Philadelphia is around about the same kind of scale. And that's what they're finding, that the route to attendance particularly is through practice, engagement, and through the family. And these role models, and a role model might be one of your parents, or it might be an extended member of your family, or it might be somebody within, you know, you might meet somebody like yourself who helps to break down some of that, these assumptions around what art is and the kind of experience that people might have when they get there.
I'm sure Mr Cummings will excuse me sort of sparing his blushes, but I mean, El Sistema would appear to be a way in which that has been achieved. I mean, are there other examples that we can look at that have worked or are working in a Scottish context, or even a Danish or international context that would help us drill down further into that 10%?
I think that there are some examples. For example, there's an organisation called Starcatchers who specialise in arts for early years, and they have shifted from putting artists in residence into a lovely nice venue where they try and bring schools and families in, to basing artists directly in family centres in areas where there isn't high participation. I think it'd be really interesting to look more at that, because that is about the whole family. I think, bringing our big thing about taking more work into schools is to bring the experience to where people are, as opposed to spending a lot of time. I've come from programming a venue where I spent hours scratching my head about how I was going to get more people in. But actually, we have right across Scotland purpose-built venues for getting work to families, which are schools and village halls. There's been far too much of a focus on creating a small number of work that tours around quite a small network of venues in Scotland, and leaves out a lot of places, and I think Orkney has done extremely well. But having lived in the Western Isles and Orkney, I think there's a huge difference in the attitude of the community towards culture in some cases.
Two particular examples to answer your question. In one of my other roles, I'm on the advisory panel for Live Music Now Scotland, which I think does a fantastic job in taking young musicians right across the sector, from rock through traditional to jazz to classical, into care homes, into the workplace, into prisons, into special schools, exactly where people are having difficulty in accessing it, and perhaps a poverty of aspiration. And the other one I refer to in my notes, of course, the Face Movement, which has grown up organically over the last 30 years, and now is many thousands of children participating. I think perhaps the challenge for the Face Movement, because it is very largely a voluntarily based and structured organisation, is it maybe needs more help to be able to do what we're talking about here, which is get into those communities and environments where there isn't that initial push
from family and role models. And I know they've done some of that through some of the work they've done in schools as well. They've been able to be funded to take traditional music into schools, but often it's a one-off example, and there isn't the follow-through that would actually take it there because there isn't the resource to do it.
I mean, is the problem that there doesn't seem to be a lack of examples? Is it a failure to kind of sustain that over a period?
Yes.
Yeah. These things are long. Building relationships, so you're working in the hardest and most marginalised communities takes a long time. And even bringing together different agencies, it's even learning the language of each other to begin to sustain that. The one challenge about creating new projects and new initiatives, we're great at new initiatives. Sistema's great, and the real challenge is connecting people to the existing infrastructure. To get them to, not get them, it's to encourage people to take the opportunities that are actually on their doorstep, that they would never dream if some organisation or some person helped to facilitate that. So I think instead of organising new things, it's actually it's just like, what's the right answer to the question? What's the question? What's the issue you're trying to solve is the real key thing, because there's plenty of examples. I mean, pretty much every arts company does work in communities and with an education world, and with parents and with children. It's how does that fizzle out?
At the moment, some people have difficulty, as we've discovered over the last few months and weeks and months, feeding their family at the moment, never mind go to the theatre, the ballet or even the cinema. What impact is the recession having on cultural participation?
The only figures I can give you just now is around the ticketing revenue. We have software on pretty much some of the major box offices in Scotland, so we're pulling out software, ticketing sales, transactional data over the last 5 years, and what we're seeing is a very similar pattern in terms of the household. It's a flat line, but what we're seeing is a small increase in yield. So people are running to stand still. So essentially, how organisations are sustaining themselves is by increasing price. So they're really doing all they can to generate the revenue. Now that's not sustainable. So if in the marketplace things don't improve, then there's not really very much more place for that to go than downwards if you're working as hard to swing that.
Has a even greater impact on the 10% who are already marginalised, and they're going to be marginalised even further.
You're seeing in many organisations a move away from concession ticket prices, for example, or concessions that are actually so small, a couple of pounds off, they make no difference. But quite a few festivals simply don't have concession prices anymore. Yeah. So even that slight inducement that might be there is disappearing under that pressure, just simply to balance the books.
And that's the corresponding yield that you see. So,
I think people are still coming in the same numbers. It would be relevant to look at who is coming, though, because I think as people can't afford various things on the spectrum, that we, in my last post, found that more people were coming to the theatre, say, than doing other things, going into town and doing other things that were more expensive. But that 10%, is even further pushed out of the way.
Yeah, going back to the very start of Liam's question, it was looking at the 90% that are participating in culture, but and therefore by implication the remaining 10%. Do you think, though, based on what you said, that perhaps what we should be looking at if we are aiming to expand cultural participation, encourage the expansion of cultural participation, isn't so much the 90% that are engaging in some form, but to break that down and look at the proportion that are going to see plays or the proportion that are going to live music, and look at that, because it seems to me, based on what you said, that the 90% suggests a healthy, thriving, everybody is participating in culture, but when you look at the different parts, there's a much more complex picture there. So do you think we should be looking sector by sector rather than as a whole as our objective? So I've got figures here that from Spice that are 31% were at live music in the last 12 months, 6% were at classical music, and basically everything in between. that seems to be a better picture of the nuances.
I think sector by sector is really interesting, because I think what happens is you tend to reduce the question down to what is it about classical music, or what is it about contemporary visual art that's the problem, as opposed to what is it about that 10% that would influence their engagement, and first of all, do we know enough about that 10%? But I think there's two things. One is the glorious 90-odd% are the 90-odd% that organisations sustain themselves with, and I think encouraging people to have a range of experience is really important, because people participate in different ways throughout their life cycle. So if you have a young family, your personal participation tends to go down, but your family engagement, or what you want your children to do, becomes more important. So that 10% is fed from the 90. But then I think a sectoral approach about that 10% is probably weaker, because you're going to need to put significant attention collectively as a sector to be able to shift that, because it's a perennial challenge. It's not going to be solved in 10 weeks with a marketing promotion.
I think there's another aspect of your question, which, again, Julia slightly touched on. I think there are a lot of people who would be classified by arts organisations as non-attenders because they hadn't been for the last 12 months, but who think of themselves as attenders. They just haven't realised it's 12 months since they were last there. And I think that's the time-poor sector of the community. And they're a very difficult one to reach, because they think that they're supporting the organisation, they're in favour of the organisation, they would call themselves a theatre lover, but they're actually not figuring in those calculations. And when they're then asked a stark question, how much have you done in the last 12 months? Well, they're not in that 30% or that 6%.
And it's also what you want that 10% to get from their cultural experience, you know. So, because we always tend to go, oh, well, the arts, and therefore click. We go ballet, opera. But actually, the range of cultural experience and what people get, you have to know more about that 10% in order to be able to, you know, present something which has a relevance and a resonance.
Thanks. We've focused on the 10% that aren't engaged at all. I'd just like to ask about the those people that do participate but have low, or the groups that have low participation levels. As a member for the West of Scotland, I'm particularly interested in participation in small urban towns, and also participation in deprived areas. Just wondered if you could answer what are the key factors in increasing participation amongst those engaged groups? What are the key factors for increasing their participation if they already are participating?
Apart from availability of a programme and a place to go, do you mean? And
a quality experience. I think we're long past the day when a pioneering company like 784 could go into the most ramshackle venue and turn it into a ceilidh for the evening. People quite rightly expect that if they're going to leave their houses, they should have a comfortable experience. Now, in the Highlands and Islands, we've had huge benefits in that. We've seen community schools being built, village halls refurbished, new venues like the expanded Eden Court in Anlanta. And I think that is part of it for many of the smaller towns, that if they have the venues, they haven't been upgraded, or they've even been closed, or they actually lack a proper kind of facility, where, unlike Screen Machine, you can't actually experience any particular art form in the way in which it should be engaged with.
There's also just a simple, basic accessibility of information. You know, if I had £1 for every time somebody said I would have gone if I'd known if it was on, I probably wouldn't need to be here. So there is something around how people get information and how easy and how visible it is for them. And the digital world is something which really helps us to accelerate that, because people's conversations are visible and online. And we can know an awful lot about how people are engaging without actually even speaking to people, because we can draw a significant amount for people who are digital savvy just by grabbing a bit of code and, working with Google, to be honest. So there's something about how people receive it, and the internet is clearly a key vehicle for that. And if you can take Visit Scotland, they're, for all the challenges that they've had of creating a portal around bringing together information on travel, transport, geography and provision, they're trying to create a certain home for that information. So I don't want to labour that too much, but there's certainly that as a barrier.
I think I would just come back to the using the resources in these places we have, like schools and village halls, better, because if we had more tours, for example, at the moment we have a show with Mull Theatre that has gone to 26 schools across from the borders. I think the furthest north it went to was Portree and up on the Aberdeenshire. And it's now about to do another big tour of 32 village halls across Scotland, including places like Rum and Muck. Now that is because they have created a piece of work that can roll up to your school hall, doesn't matter the size, doesn't matter the technical requirements, and perform for the whole community. So what they're doing is going in and performing in the school in the evening, and the tour is called the Wee Night Out Tour because it's about the whole community coming along to the school in the evening. Interestingly, what we found when we were visiting schools to set that up is the areas where we had most difficulty finding a school was Edinburgh. Because now because of Olympiad funding, these performances are going into schools for free. The school get it for free. They can then sell tickets to their own community to fundraise for the school, or they can offer it as a free performance. And a huge number of schools in Edinburgh turned us down because the teachers weren't interested in working in the evening. As soon as we went north of Perth or south of Edinburgh, the schools were biting off our hands for the opportunity. So there are some advantages in rural communities as well as disadvantages. But I think if we had more, if we had, to hark back again to the Danish scheme, if we had more work that was touring into schools, both during the day for class time experience, but also as a venue in its own right, I think we would see a lot better access.
You're saying that the main reason that you couldn't get access to one local authority area is because they couldn't staff it in the evening, is that what you're saying? And it was only Edinburgh?
Well, it came to Edinburgh in particular because that's where our children's festival is in May, and that was the local authority that we had problems, yeah.
Good.
Mr Livingston, you mentioned 784 and how there's problems now engaging people and maybe new approaches. How were projects like 784 able to engage people in deprived areas previously? And I wonder if you could expand a wee bit more on what the problems now that programmes like that
I think it's because when 784 started with the Cheviot and shows like that, it was a new paradigm. It completely broke the mould of what theatre should be, because it broke out of the fourth wall, it broke off the stage. It was like a variety show, it was engaging, the audience was then caught up in a ceilidh at the end of it. And that's why I was citing something like Play Pie and a Pint now as being one of the current changing paradigms. And I think that's what we need more of, but not, as Julie says, not as one-off projects. The great thing about Oran Moor is that it's been able to prove its value with, 300 shows now? You need that level of continuity. 784, similarly, it was the next show they took out and the one after that actually built the audience and meant it wasn't just a flash in the pan, and really helped to create the idea that touring theatre in remote and rural areas was something that mattered and that could engage with communities. So yes, we need new paradigms and ways to support them.
Is that point about consistency though, if there's a really practical thing about engagement, which is people need time to plan. They need that ability to go, I actually know that if I miss it this time, it's coming around next year. So, and the word of mouth is, for that is time to grow. I mean, if you have a busy life or a busy family, That's not a wouldn't it be nice, that's a have to, whether it's you're a highly engaged family or not. So the consistency, so the kind of boom and bust project kind of relationship, and also the thing around 784 is that notion of it's more than just a piece of theatre, it's an experience. You know, a Ceilidh afterwards, I'm not suggesting for a minute that everybody does a Ceilidh after their show, but it's much rounder than just going there at 7 o'clock, watching it and going home again. There's a whole nature of being able to explain and unpack it.
I think you're quite right. They were also consistently touring around small communities in Scotland over a period of 20 years, so the audience that they built up over that time was very significant.
The companies we have and try and support in the Highlands, because with the exception of Mull Theatre, they're almost entirely project-based, they may only get a tour out once every 18 months or so. So they can build familiarity, and that tour may only play for 2 to 3 weeks, and then the investment in the show is gone, because there isn't funding to restage that, even if it's been a success. So continuity, I think, absolutely crucial factor.
Yeah, and actually it's when you're restaging a show that it becomes financially viable and can then tour around communities on the longer term.
Could I ask a supplementary to something earlier first, Chair? Is that okay? It's just to drill down in this idea of the engagement and the multi-agency work. The Scottish Book Trust is working with vulnerable families at the moment, as well as providing the free books to all children in Scotland. They're doing specifically to vulnerable children, and obviously there's an encouragement there, hopefully, to get the children then along to the library events where they're doing the sing-songs and the nursery rhymes and all these kind of cultural activities. So are you engaging with people who are delivering GIRFEC? Have you been involved in any of the consultations to see if there's an opportunity to feed in and take part in that process further?
In my previous job, I worked with East Renfrewshire Council, so we programmed a lot with BookBug, because that was a fantastic way. We had quite a strong early years programme of theatre and dance anyway. So currently working for an arts organisation, we haven't had much communication or involvement with GIRFEC. So I think that would be a really good way forward. I think it would be good to look at the issue of entitlement for children, because at the moment, as you can see, there are really good examples of work happening. But until something is statutory, local authority provision is going to be postcode. And that's my experience of working for local authorities across Scotland.
And that's really interesting when you focus on the audience as opposed to the art form or the sector. Then you're saying, well, if I have somebody brought into that experience of reading, for example, where else would it be natural for them to go? Not what provision do we provide? And how's that connection made stronger? So it's the point about that map. How am I going to lead people through their cultural life so that I maybe don't have to do it all, you know?
And I think too, one of the difficulties that I alluded in my paper is the reduction in staff resources within individual local authorities. The loss of cultural coordinators in many local authorities, for example, who would be the natural interface with a project like that. And it puts an extra burden on companies like the ones that Fiona works with to try to plug that gap.
And the sort of main question was, it was really, as someone who was switched on to being a lifelong opera fan because of the Opera in the Round that was done, that I experienced as a primary school child in Shotts. I'm also very aware that in observation, the thing that I see that most enthuses young people and brings the families in is that the ability to participate rather than just being consumers of the arts. So really, are there particular projects that are working at the moment to promote and bring in audiences that are good examples of things from the past or that are happening at the moment you would commend?
Is a terrific one in terms of the work that Scottish Opera is doing. I'm not as familiar, I have to say, with everything, but I think that is your point is, go where the communities are. That work is hugely beneficial. We've got you as for a start. So this company's doing a lot of that. It's just that what's the next step once they've stimulated that interest?
I think it has to be a combination of participating things, but also being really excited by something you see. If you speak to people who work in the arts, they have something that they remember from being a child that they saw, and that's what it was that made them pursue the career that they pursued. So, you know, if we really want to have equality of access, then we need that type of experience, whether it's participatory or I'm sitting in an audience and I'm watching professionals doing something exciting. That needs to be more across the board and not down to individual head teacher choice or local authority choice, which is a huge issue. Having said that, when I go to other places in Europe, they are so excited by what they see in the Curriculum for Excellence. So we have it there. We just need more resources to get into all the schools to actually make sure that everybody is having access to professionals, either coming in for participatory experiences or for a performance.
And it is both schools and family. I mean, certainly in North America, the route in is through schools, the practice, and family. So practice is the route in, actually doing something or engaging is the route in. But they don't necessarily see it as a linear thing. You don't practice just to attend. You know, practice has got all sorts of benefits in and of itself. It might be that you end up, you know, doing some other form of cultural
it's
activity.
quite related to the debate that you've just had about music provision, because if you have one local authority that's charging £200 a year and one where it's free, what sense is that entitlement to music? Who are you missing that might actually have come into music and either become the audience in 20 years' time or the next Nicola Benedetti? You know, how are you going to ensure that children have equality? Because that 10% are in our schools mostly. How are you going to reach them all if we have that kind of postcode approach to provision?
I wanted to return to the point about 784 because I think it's important, and I wanted to talk about content rather than structures, because we have talked a lot about structures, and it seems to me that the reason why 784 was so popular, along with Wildcat and the other touring companies of that era, was because it was providing content for people in the language that they spoke, which is Scots, and was actually directly relating to their experience. And probably showing my age, but I went to the first tour of the Steamy when it came to Greenock, and the hall was absolutely packed out, and you know, it was sold out, and every community that the Steamy played in around Scotland was packed out. And I think that was because it directly related to the cultural experience of the audience. And I wondered whether, you know, we've talked about the success of traditional arts in the Highlands and the Fèis movement, and I wondered about urban Scotland and the cultural traditions and backgrounds of the people who live in those communities, whether we have done enough to address that, and whether there is an overreaching commitment to try to get content to those people which validates their experience and the language that they speak in.
I think there is quite a lot of I can only talk about theatre now. I think there is quite a lot of work in Scots, and the Steamy has actually just done another big tour. So that work that's good keeps touring and keeps going. I think 784, I used to be on their board, so I should probably state that. I would say they were good, but they created work that was not only in Scots, but also was about issues that people are interested in. So I think they had a very successful model of work. But I think there is a lot of work like that that's still touring. I don't think it's.
I think what I'm getting at is whether we need some kind of strategy. Well, it's fantastic. I mean, I'm a fan of opera and ballet, and I think it's great that we can get those art forms into all sorts of communities. But there is a very specific issue about, you know, actually building confidence so that people can see their language spoken and performed and participate. And I wondered whether we need a strategy similar to the way that we have a strategy for Gaelic for that, and whether that would actually build people's confidence and encourage them to participate more.
The Gaelic example is an interesting one because there was a very strong feeling that Gaelic needed theatre provision as an absolute central part of it. And historically, over 2 major efforts, it has not proven successful because it was put in place as a strategic intervention rather than coming out, as Wildcat in 784 did, of an artistic and a social drive of the people within it. So I think you need to be sure that you're not missing the people who do want to do this kind of work, but the danger is in creating it top down rather than actually supporting the grassroots ambition of particular creative people.
I think that's a really important point. I mean, I can't talk really so much about artistic product, but rather about the notion of difference amongst populations. And, you know, to have a sense of it's about Scots language and therefore this is the policy on theatre. It actually isn't reflective maybe of the majority of people's lives. So I suppose what I'm arguing for is a greater understanding of the views and needs and opinions and circumstances of individuals, because it's from there that great work comes. I mean, often visual artists, for example, will immerse themselves in communities, and from that comes a bit of work that you might not even recognise, but it has a resonance, not because it's Scots per se, but it actually reflects the needs and the culture and the history and the background and the language of the people who live there, and these differences are expressed very, very clearly in various parts of Scotland. So I think I would find it very difficult to have e-policy, because you could see where that might go. The danger is, you know, everything's steamy. It's based in the kind of 1940s, and it's, you know, Doric or something. So that doesn't reflect the needs and opinions and backgrounds of the majority of people.
Liz?
Yeah. Just to develop some of the very interesting themes that you've spoken about, in terms of getting people to come back to things rather than new initiatives, which I think you've all spoken very strongly about, do you have specific examples across Scotland where there has been a very high degree of success of getting the consistency that you mentioned, of people returning to the same type of production? I mean, what are the examples in Scotland where we've had the biggest success? And if you can point to these examples, what are the specific features of these projects that have worked?
I don't think specific shows, because they often don't come around. Particular art forms that we've looked at have their fans. And there are some very simple initiatives around about retention. You know, any commercial company will, you know, there is about promotions and incentivising that, and subscriptions and memberships and loyalty campaigns. So they're practical things, you know, the simplest things, to be honest. And some of the larger companies are able to do that because they have the resources to focus their effort on, and also they have the information to help them. You know, if you don't actually know what the pattern of attendance is, that you're not able to gather that information, and you don't have access to it, you can't actually do anything about it. So there are examples of people doing it, and I hate to use some, but loyalty and subscription packages are one of them, and you very clearly see that across Scotland.
I think the whole festival experience points to that, because I think festivals are one area where we do see that loyalty being built up very quickly. That new festivals within this period of 2 or 3 years can have built up a loyal following that becomes the core of what they want to do. And I think the lesson from that is it's predictable. You know that the next one is going to, will have different content, be roughly like what you had before, but with something that will be surprising and unusual. And perhaps related to that, a company like the Scottish Ensemble, who are not touring all the year round. They're not having, like, say, the RSNO to play every night in the season. But they'll come to Eden Court, they'll do 4 concerts in the year, and you'd see that the audiences for those concerts is much wider age range and demographic than for the conventional orchestras. Because, again, it's sizable, 4 concerts, it's predictable, but they themselves are edgy and exciting in what they present.
And also have the practical equipment, if you like, the infrastructure that allows people to track that. It's really important. You know, there's a kind of sense of, you know, build it and they'll come and we'll just fire it out and all. I mean, or more, it's very specific. It is predictable, it's the same price, it's highly targeted. You know, it's a kind of simple stuff.
Is there specific evidence that suggests that the communities where there is a high degree of success are those where both the local business community and perhaps the hotel network pitches into a higher degree? For example, Pitlochry Theatre, they speak very highly about their sort of local business group and the fact that hotels pitch in. Do you think there's sufficient evidence that suggests that we need to do more to help that?
I certainly think, for coming back to your point about smaller towns, I think those relationships are absolutely crucial. And it was interesting that my understanding is that the attitude in Pitlochry changed when the theatre was closed, because that was when the business community realised the gap. And I think being able to show those kinds of examples in other communities to make better relationships. But yes, I think there's considerable scope for working on that.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Really, just to go back to the 784 thing, and the discussion that we're having now, of course, is absolutely endless. I mean, it's been going for generations, hundreds of years, I suspect, and it will continue, because it is about, you know, what makes something good that you want to go and see, and what my opinion of something good might be your opinion of something absolutely awful. But for my tuppence worth, I mean, what 784 did with no government funding, it has to be said. I mean, they weren't invested in for a number of years. They actually had a story to tell that was about the people that they were taking it to. And my God, they fought for these bums on seats. I mean, and I do remember this, I saw it in the Caledonian Hotel dining room in Ullapool, and they were round every door. They didn't put a leaflet through, they knocked the door and said, would you like to come to this? And I'll sell you a ticket just now. And it's actually, and they say, what is it about? And they said, you. It's about you. And actually, it's Shakespeare probably articulates that better than anybody, but that's what the theatre is to do. It should be actually delivering that message. And I think that there is, you know, we can have examples of local authority, and there's a shiver down my spine if we think of that kind of bureaucracy that delivers somehow statutory provision, and nobody ever put a poster up, and nobody ever asked anybody to buy a ticket. Now that has happened, and we have withdrawn over the years a number of the paid employees by councils who might actually have been the whippers in, or those people who kind of excited an audience to come. But, you know, there's been so many changes in all of that. And again, a play behind the pint. I mean, the real, for me, I think the real message in this is that we have to confidently invest in the artist. The person who didn't get the money was John McGrath, who wrote the piece. We resisted that. And so it should be. I mean, the artist should always be fighting government or delivering a different message. And that's their role. But that tension will always exist. But if the nation is open to allow the artist to work, then, you know, there's the right to fail has to be in there as well as the right to success. I mean, we're terribly keen to praise the right of success. I suspect the National Theatre of Scotland did, in my experience and in my opinion, a number of productions that outstripped Black Watch by 1 million light years, in my opinion. And yet, it was Black Watch that caught the public imagination, and is now, I think, in 4 productions or something around the world. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but
it's irrelevant.
There is... Sorry.
Gina, I think what you're saying, a lot of relevance, but could we keep it brief? I could answers and questions brief, please.
I think
observation.
There's another side to the 784 story, which is the other company that opened up the Highlands for Theatre at the same time was the Medieval Players, a bunch of graduates from Cambridge. How did he do it? In exactly the same way Jean's describing. They'd arrive in the community and they'd process down the street with a guy in devil costume accosting all the wifeys and a cart, and they just made it exciting. So relevance is what you make of it. It's how you actually reach out to engage people.
But knowing about that relevance is knowing about the people that you're trying to engage with. You know, so I suppose one of the things that slightly depresses me about the conversation at 784 is the world is changing, and the personal connection is made much more easily in the digital world, and people are looking for a connection to something that's relevant. And the tools are there for us to do that without having to parade down the street or knock on people's doors. We're in their hand now, more than any time.
Okay, Marco.
I resist the urge to make any observations on that, and I'll just go on to something that I think we've slightly avoided so far in talking about performance related culture, but the question of museums. And looking back at those figures, there's 28% have attended a museum in the last 12 months, and I'll get my knuckles rapped from my party's positivity brigade for being glass half empty, but that means there's 72% that haven't been at a museum in the last 12 months. One of the things that was pointed out in the High Arts contribution was the importance and the changing role of small independent museums and the difficulties they're having almost in keeping up with larger, better resourced counterparts that are also free. And clearly this is an area of importance and one where there's direct impacts from government policy. And I wonder if perhaps you could give your impression of where we should be going with museums in Scotland, because clearly we don't want the value of the small independent museums to wither on the vine, because they have a very important contribution to make.
Well, I think one step that's already happening, which is the creation of the new national development body out of Museums and Galleries Scotland, is a big step in that direction, because as I understand it, this new body will be looking at heritage as a totality and will be able to involve itself with the work of Historic Scotland, the work of the National Trust, and of visitor centres that are not themselves accredited museums. So being able to see the sector as a totality will be a huge plus for the first time, in the way that the Arts Council, now Creative Scotland, has been able to see the arts world as a totality. I think too that these independent museums need to be helped to, as I suggested in my paper, move back into a more central role within their communities, which they often had when they were created. And there's a number in Highlands that opened up in the 80s and 90s. With a very great fanfare. But of course, they've never had the resources to recapitalise. So their displays are now very tired, often out of date. They may be using technology that's clapped out. So there is a need for investment. And Museums and Galleries Scotland, as it currently is, does its best, but it has very modest resources for that. I do hope that the new resources flowing back into Heritage Lottery post the Olympics will help with that, because clearly that will at least make a new capital resources available that haven't been so readily accessible for some years.
Up on that, in the sense, going back to our earlier discussion about ensuring that it remains relevant and talks to people in a language that is their language, and as Jean says, it says as much about them as anything else. Is there a danger that we may be too wedded to particular bricks and mortar or particular exhibitions because, in a sense, they are there, and therefore there'll be a tendency to kind of recapitalise them rather than move it on and provide the seed funding for something else that may actually capture the imagination more?
I think you're absolutely right. I think part of that difficulty is that we still frequently have groups who are looking to save a building and think that a museum or an arts facility is the way to save it. And too often what that creates is a white elephant. Because probably what that cultural facility needed was either something that wasn't shackled by a building or was in a purpose-built building like the lovely new production centre that Mull Theatre has, for example, or the Murray Arts Centre. Not shoved into a 19th century former school or hospital that is access problems, accommodation problems, heating problems, and so on.
My question. Sorry, I was just listening to the conversation. I wanted to ask you about the National Gaelic Language Plan, that this committee scrutinised it, and it makes recommendation on promotion and showcasing of Gaelic, particularly around the Commonwealth Games, the Ryder Cup, and the Year of Homecoming, and what your view on, I guess, on that whole issue might be in terms of promotion engagement, where it's quite a specific promotion of the Gaelic language.
Well, if I come back to the point I made earlier about the difficulty in setting up a unique and dedicated Gaelic theatre, I think there is much more scope for being able to encourage and resource arts organisations in all fields to make more use of Gaelic within their activities, whether that's as visual artists, as musicians, or as theatre companies. And that, I think, is the way, to use a horrible phrase, it becomes more normalised. So I think it's about that permeation through the artistic community is the way to do it.
Is there any evidence that links the increased attendance, or indeed attendance as an audience member in cultural events to actual culture, creativity, participation? And has any exercise been done to try to trace the links between the two?
I'm sure there is. Honestly, well, my apologies. There's nothing that springs to mind right now in terms of a specific report on that. I think the assumptions are that increased access and participation leads to more frequent participation and deeper range of experience. But whether it turns you into the next, Bill Gates, I'm not quite sure.
It's interesting to give a very specific example. The Eden Court Theatre runs drama and dance qualification courses for teenagers who are not able to get them through Highland schools that don't have those courses. On the whole, the youngsters coming through that are not then going on to study drama at college or university level. They're understanding that their roundedness as people will be enhanced by doing something like that. And those are people who are making the effort to travel 50, 60 miles each weekend to take part in those courses. So as in so many areas, as Julie's touched on, there's anecdotal evidence, but not necessarily hard statistical evidence.
Can I ask just finally, if there's more recognition of, or a growing recognition of more informal activity that's going on within the community. I'm thinking, for example, I would much prefer to go to my local miners' welfare club and watch a comedian than I would to go to the opera or the ballet. That's just my preference. Some people may wish to go to football at Hampden, but somebody might wish to go and watch a amateur team in their local community. Is there more recognition of that? And how do we actually get some of the funding to those maybe more informal cultural activities that in communities are hugely important to that locality?
It's probably a Jean Urquhart in every village in Scotland if you want that to happen, making sure that things happen. And a lot of it is I'm just thinking of the folk club scene and things that are on a much more informal level.
I'll give you an example. I sit in the board of a community development trust in where I have done since it started, and we run various things. But a lot of the musical activity involves young people who are inspired by 2 or 3 older people, and they run a whole host of charity events where there is fantastic talent on show. They get not a coin of funding for any of that. So how do we get them to access the funding? The trust does some of it, but it's increasingly difficult in the current climate and will only get worse. But these activities are going on in not just my community, in every community, and yet very, very unrecognised and a lot of the time unsupported.
I think the real threat to that we've seen, certainly in the local authority areas we work in, is the disappearance of discretionary grants programmes, because that's the kind of route that is natural for those sorts of community groups to go to. I don't want to single one out, but in Aberdeenshire, for example, our grant budget of £600,000 has disappeared in the space of 2 years. And that's a huge resource that was going out in grants of a few thousand and a few hundred here and there. But the word was discretionary, so it didn't seem as if, as Fiona pointed out, this was something statutory. So that's certainly been one big area that's hit this community.
And would that be an example where, for an organisation now to access that money, they have to have a constitution, a bank account, and all the bureaucracy that we put in place to prevent organic community-based arts taken off. Is that what kind of where you're getting at there?
Well, I think even with the existing local authority grants, often that was still required. But yes, for many of the other funds that are still available, I'm thinking of LEADER, for example, those are way beyond the reach of any kind of small community group, whether formal or informal.
There's another aspect to that, which is almost the reverse of it. How do you encourage those groups who are self-starting and have probably gone pretty much without us in the sector? How do we encourage the link and the route back into the resources to influence the resources that are already being spent within the sector? So there's a kind of tremendous sense of, well, we'll do that for that lot over there, but there's still a huge amount of individuals and households engaging in the sector. So it's trying to bridge that link rather than trying to finding more money. But I completely agree. Small amounts of money go a significant way, and they don't exist anymore.
Okay, Kirsty, thank you very much for giving the evidence this morning, and can I wish you a safe journey home, and meeting's over.